It is 2 a.m. on a Tuesday in January 1958. Inside the bedroom of a terraced house in the Midlands, the air is so cold that your breath forms a white cloud above the eiderdown. You wake up with a sinking feeling of dread, not because of a nightmare, but because of a simple biological need. You need the toilet. In a modern home, this would be a barefoot stumble across a warm landing. But in 1950s Britain, it is a tactical military operation. You slide out of the warmth of the bed, shivering violently as your feet hit the freezing linoleum. You pull a heavy wool coat over your pajamas and shove your feet into unlaced boots. Downstairs, the house is silent and pitch black. You unlatch the back door, and the winter wind hits you like a physical blow, carrying sleet sideways into the kitchen. The target is 20 feet away at the bottom of the dark, overgrown yard, a small, menacing brick shed covered in ivy. Clutching a flickering candle or a dim torch, you begin the long march over the icy cobbles, knowing that the ordeal of the freezing wooden seat and the spiders lurking in the corners is about to begin. This wasn't just a bathroom break, it was a test of courage. To the modern mind, placing the most private, essential room of the house at the bottom of a freezing garden seems like an act of cruelty. But to understand the existence of the outdoor toilet, we must look back at the Victorian architects who built the streets of Britain. They weren't trying to be cruel. They were terrified. In the 19th century, when the great swathes of terraced housing were thrown up in Manchester, Leeds, and London, the prevailing medical theory was miasma. Doctors believed that disease was carried by bad air and foul smells. Therefore, the logic dictated that the toilet, the source of the worst smells, must be kept as far away from the living quarters as possible. If you brought the toilet inside, the Victorians believed, you were inviting cholera and typhoid into your parlor. So, they banished it to the yard, separating the drain from the dinner table by a 20-foot buffer zone of cobblestones and fresh air. By the 1950s, the germ theory had long since disproved miasma, but the bricks remained. Millions of British families were living in the architectural legacy of a previous century. The Privy, the Netty, or the Khazi was usually a small, stand-alone brick shed. It was cold, damp, and utterly utilitarian. The walls were often whitewashed, not for decoration, but because white lime was a disinfectant that supposedly kept the lice at bay. The door was usually made of rough planks with a gap at the top and bottom for ventilation, which unfortunately acted as a superhighway for the wind to whistle through. In rural areas or the older slums, these weren't even flush toilets. They were ash pits or pail closets, essentially a bucket under a wooden bench that had to be emptied manually by the night soil men, a grim profession that disappeared slowly. But even in the towns with sewage systems, the outdoor flush toilet was primitive. The cistern was often made of heavy cast iron, mounted high on the wall to give the water enough gravitational force to clear the bowl. The chain was a rusted metal pull that required a knack to operate, a sharp, aggressive yank that would unleash a deafening Niagara-like roar that echoed down the alleyway, announcing your business to the entire neighborhood. The location of the toilet turned the backyard into a thoroughfare. The yard wasn't a garden, it was a utility space. It was where the coal was stored, where the washing was hung, and where the tin bath was scrubbed. But primarily, it was the path to the loo. In many streets, the toilet wasn't even private to one house. It was shared. A block of 4 toilets might serve a row of 8 houses. The key would hang on a piece of string by the back door. This created a unique social anxiety. If you saw your neighbor heading down the yard, you had to wait. You would watch through the net curtains, timing your run to avoid the embarrassment of bumping into them as they emerged. There was no soundproofing in a single brick shed. Every cough, every rustle of paper, and the thunderous flush was audible to the woman hanging out her washing next door. It destroyed privacy, but it also enforced a strange kind of intimacy. You knew your neighbors' habits, their schedules, and their health, simply by the rhythm of the backyard door opening and closing. It was a life lived in public, dictated by the architecture of the past. Because the journey to the outdoor toilet was so arduous, especially in the depths of winter or the middle of the night, British households developed an alternative solution. It was an object of both immense utility and deep shame: the chamber pot. Known colloquially as the Guzunder, because it goes under the bed, the jerry or the po, this ceramic or enameled metal pot, lived beneath the bed frame of almost every bedroom in the country. It was the emergency reserve. If a child woke up at 3 a.m. needing to go, no mother in her right mind would send them out into the snow. Instead, they used the pot. This created a grim morning ritual known as sloping out. Every morning, before breakfast, the pots had to be emptied. The mother, it was almost always the mother, would carry these sloshing vessels of urine carefully down the steep, narrow staircase, through the kitchen where the porridge was boiling, and out into the yard to empty them into the privy. The smell was inescapable. In a small house with no central heating and windows that were often kept shut to keep out the smog, the scent of the night soil lingered. It was a smell of stale ammonia that permeated the bedding and the carpets. It was a daily reminder of the primitive conditions people were living in. There was also a profound lack of dignity involved. Using a chamber pot in a room shared with siblings or parents required a suspension of embarrassment. You learned to be silent. You learned to look away. The sound of the stream hitting the ceramic in the silence of the night was deafening to a self-conscious teenager. It stripped away modesty. This lack of indoor sanitation also affected personal hygiene. Without a bathroom sink, hands were washed in the kitchen sink, the same sink where the dishes were washed and the vegetables were peeled. Or more likely, they weren't washed at all after a trip to the yard. The separation of the toilet from the washing facilities broke the hygiene chain. It was a world of rough and ready cleanliness, where germs were accepted as a part of life, and where the struggle to stay clean was a constant, exhausting battle against the infrastructure of the home itself. If the journey to the toilet was a trial, the experience inside was a torture, largely due to a specific product that holds a legendary status in British horror stories: Izal medicated toilet tissue. In the modern world, we expect toilet paper to be soft, absorbent, and perhaps even scented. Izal was none of these things. It came in a flat box or a tight roll, and each sheet was impregnated with a strong disinfectant that smelled like a hospital corridor. But its most defining characteristic was its texture. One side was rough, and the other side was shiny, almost like tracing paper or baking parchment. It was waterproof. It was completely non-absorbent. Attempting to use it was an exercise in futility and frustration. It didn't wipe. It smeared. It crinkled loudly, announcing your every move to the neighbors. It was slippery, cold, and harsh on the skin. Yet it was ubiquitous. Schools, councils, and thrifty grandmothers swore by it, believing that the medicated coating killed germs. It was hygiene as punishment. For families who couldn't afford Izal, or who simply refused to subject themselves to it, there was the cheaper alternative: the newspaper. A square of the Daily Mirror or the Radio Times, cut into neat rectangles and threaded onto a piece of string hanging from a rusty nail on the door. This was recycling before the word existed. Using newspaper required technique. You had to scrunch it up vigorously in your hand to soften the fibers before use. Otherwise, the ink would transfer, leaving you with the headlines quite literally printed on your backside. It was rough, it was messy, but it was warmer and softer than the dreaded Izal. It also provided reading material. Many a British child learned to read by deciphering the fragments of news stories while sitting in the freezing cold. You might read half a football report or the horoscope section before putting it to its final use. It was a crude, resourceful solution that defined the poverty and pragmatism of the era. Beyond the cold and the paper, the outdoor toilet was a kingdom of terror for another reason: the wildlife. The Netty was rarely a sealed environment. It was a brick shed with gaps under the door, cracks in the masonry, and a ventilation hole high up in the wall. It was the perfect habitat for the British spider. These were not the small, friendly house spiders. In the damp, dark corners of the Privy, giant Tegenaria domestica, house spiders, thrived. To a child's eye, they looked as big as dinner plates. They would hang motionless in the corners, or worse, scuttle across the whitewashed walls just as you sat down. The fear of a spider dropping from the ceiling onto your bare skin was a primal dread that haunted every trip. You would enter the toilet armed with a rolled-up newspaper, checking every corner, sweeping the seat, conducting a full perimeter sweep before daring to disrobe. Then there were the rats. In the older terraced streets, the drains were old and the sewers were close to the surface. It was not unheard of for a rat to find its way up the U-bend. The urban legend of the rat in the toilet was whispered in playgrounds across the country, terrifying a generation of children into hovering rather than sitting. But the most pervasive fear was the darkness itself. In the 1950s, few outdoor toilets had electric lights. If you were lucky, you took a torch with a dying battery. If not, you had a candle. The candle cast long, dancing shadows against the brickwork, turning the spider webs into monsters and the coat hook on the door into a looming figure. If the wind blew through the gaps, the candle would flicker and die, plunging you into absolute, suffocating blackness at the bottom of the garden. You were isolated. You were cut off from the safety of the house. The 20-foot dash back to the back door, pursued by imaginary monsters and the very real cold, was a sprint for survival. It instilled a toughness in children, a familiarity with the dark and the damp, that has perhaps been lost in our brightly lit, centrally heated world. If the spiders and the dark were the chronic, nagging pains of the outdoor toilet, the acute crisis, the moment that is etched into the national consciousness as the absolute nadir of the experience, arrived on Boxing Day, 1962. This was the start of the Big Freeze, a winter so ferocious that it would hold Britain in a relentless icy grip for 3 months. And for the outdoor toilet, it was a death sentence. In January 1963, the temperature in Britain did not rise above freezing for weeks on end. The effect on the nation's primitive plumbing was catastrophic. The water in the cast-iron cisterns, mounted high on the brick walls of the privies, didn't just get cold. It turned into a solid, immovable block of ice. The ball cocks seized. The pipes, exposed to the biting east wind, froze solid. The morning ritual changed from a shiver to a battle. You would pull the chain, and instead of the roar of water, there would be a dull, metallic clunk. Nothing happened. The mechanism was dead. This sparked a wave of desperate, dangerous amateur engineering across the country. Fathers and husbands would march down the garden path armed with rolled-up newspapers set on fire, holding them under the lead pipes in a frantic attempt to thaw them out. Others, more technologically advanced, used paraffin blow lamps. The roar of the blowtorch and the smell of singing paint became the soundtrack of the neighborhood. But the greatest mistake, a tragedy repeated in thousands of homes, was the boiling kettle. In a panic to clear a frozen toilet bowl, people poured boiling water directly onto the freezing ceramic. The laws of physics were unforgiving. Crack! The sudden thermal shock shattered the pans, splitting them down the middle and rendering the toilet useless. With the flush systems destroyed, the outdoor toilet ceased to be a piece of sanitation and reverted to being a simple bucket. The dignity of the nation collapsed. Families were forced to use the toilet and then flush it manually with buckets of gray water saved from the washing up, assuming the drain itself wasn't frozen. If the drain was blocked with ice, the toilet simply filled up. It was a squalid, freezing, nightmare. The winter of '63 exposed the obsolescence of the outdoor toilet in a way that nothing else could. Here we were, a nation that was launching satellites and listening to the Beatles, yet we were living like medieval peasants, hacking at ice in our own backyards just to perform basic bodily functions. The romance of the hardy British spirit evaporated in the face of the yellow snow and the frozen pipes. We realized, collectively and shivering, that the Victorian age had to end. We couldn't go on living like this. If the winter of 1963 was the stick, the carrot came in the form of a piece of paper that changed the architectural face of Britain, the Standard Improvement Grant. By the mid-1960s, the government realized it couldn't demolish every terraced house in the country. There were simply too many of them. Instead, they decided to modernize them. A wave of renovation swept through the working-class streets. It was the era of the bathroom extension. You can still see them today on the backs of millions of Victorian terraces, a flat-roofed brick box tacked onto the back of the kitchen. For a child growing up in the late '60s, the arrival of the builder's van was more exciting than Christmas. It meant the end of the Long March. The construction was often chaotic. Families lived in dust and rubble for weeks. The back wall of the kitchen was knocked through, creating a strange new geography where you walked past the oven to get to the bath. But when it was finished, it was nothing short of miraculous. For the first time, the toilet was inside. It was usually a low-level suite, meaning the cistern was just behind the seat, not looming high on the wall like a sword of Damocles, and it flushed with a polite, efficient whoosh rather than a thunderous roar. But the real revolution was the suite itself. We didn't just embrace indoor plumbing. We celebrated it with color. This was the dawn of the Avocado Bathroom Suite, or perhaps Pampas Green or Whisper Pink. We rejected clinical white because white reminded us of the whitewashed walls of the outdoor Privy. We wanted luxury. We wanted carpet on the bathroom floor. A hygiene disaster in hindsight, but a symbol of warmth then. We bought pedestal mats that fit around the base of the toilet and fluffy covers for the lid. The first time a family used their indoor toilet was a moment of genuine reverence. To be able to wake up in the middle of the night, walk 10 paces to a warm room, and sit down without fearing frostbite or spiders, felt like the ultimate victory of civilization. We spent hours in there. The bathroom became a sanctuary, a place to read, to think, and to soak in a bath that didn't have to be filled by a kettle. The Netty at the bottom of the garden was abandoned, left to the spiders and the rust, a relic of a harder, colder time that we were all too happy to leave behind. The end of the outdoor toilet era marked a significant shift in the geography of the backyard. Once the plumbing was brought inside, the brick shed at the bottom of the garden lost its purpose. For a few years, it stood as a ghostly reminder of the past, perhaps used to store coal or garden tools, but eventually the sledgehammers came out. In the late 1970s and 80s, a wave of domestic demolition swept the backyards of Britain. The Privy was knocked down. The high brick walls that separated the yards were lowered or replaced with fences. The space was reclaimed. The yard, which had been a utilitarian thoroughfare for coalmen and night soil men, was transformed into something new. A garden. People planted rose bushes where the toilet used to be. They laid turf over the cobblestones. They put up washing lines that didn't have to dodge a brick shed. But in gaining this space, something subtle was lost. The over-the-wall culture began to fade. In the days of the outdoor toilet, you couldn't avoid your neighbors. The shared rhythm of trips to the bottom of the garden meant you were constantly bumping into each other. Conversations happened over the low brick walls while you waited your turn. "Morning, love. Cold one today, isn't it?" was the standard greeting. It was a forced intimacy, yes, but it bound the street together. With the toilet moved inside, that reason to be in the yard disappeared. We retreated into our warm, carpeted homes. We no longer saw Mrs. Jones at 7 a.m. in her dressing gown. We no longer heard the cough of Mr. Smith next door. The backyard became a private leisure space, not a public utility. The gossip stopped flowing. The community became a little more private, a little more closed off. We gained sanitation, but we lost a specific kind of shared suffering that had been the glue of the working-class street. Culturally, the move indoors marked the moment the British character began to soften. For generations, the outdoor toilet had been a daily physical test of endurance. It forged a specific kind of stoicism. You couldn't be precious if you had to wipe snow off the toilet seat before you sat down. You couldn't be squeamish if you had to confront a spider the size of a saucer before breakfast. It bred a toughness, a resilience to discomfort that was woven into the national DNA. But once the Avocado Suite was installed, that daily battle vanished. We became a nation of comfort seekers. We started to take warmth for granted. The toilet, once a place of dread, became a place of leisure. We put bookshelves in there. We installed radios. We started to spend time in the bathroom rather than treating it as a smash-and-grab raid on biology. Today, the idea of walking outside to use the toilet is unthinkable to a modern child, something reserved for camping trips or music festivals, and even then, complained about bitterly. We now have downstairs cloakrooms and en-suites. We have houses with 3, sometimes 4 toilets. We have successfully sanitized our lives to the point where the biological reality of waste is hidden behind soundproof doors and scented candles. We have undoubtedly gained a better quality of life. Dysentery and typhoid are things of the past. The smell of the night soil has been replaced by the smell of synthetic ocean breeze air fresheners. But perhaps we lost a little bit of our edge. The outdoor toilet was a great leveler. It didn't matter if you were the man of the house or the smallest child. The frost bit everyone equally. It was a shared hardship that anchored us in the physical reality of the world, cold, dark, and occasionally terrifying. By bringing it inside, we closed the door on the elements, and in doing so, we became a little more comfortable, but perhaps a little less brave. To the modern generation, raised in a world of en-suite bathrooms, heated towel rails, and triple-ply tissue, the story of the outdoor toilet sounds like a grim fairy tale from the dark ages. They listen with wide eyes to the tales of the long march down the garden path, the spiders and the newspaper squares, and they shudder. They cannot conceive of a life where the simple act of going to the loo required a coat, a torch, and a steel nerve. But for those who lived through it, the memory of the Netty or the Khazi is a badge of honor. It is a shared scar that binds a generation together. It was a daily lesson in the harsh reality of the physical world. It taught you that life wasn't always comfortable, that the dark wasn't going to hurt you, even if the spiders might, and that you could endure physical discomfort without making a fuss. It built a resilience, a hardy grit that is perhaps missing in our temperature-controlled, sanitized modern lives. We look back at those brick sheds now with a mixture of horror and humor. We laugh about the freezing seats and the rough paper, but beneath the laughter there is a recognition of how far we have come. The transition from the bucket in the yard to the Avocado Suite upstairs was one of the greatest leaps in living standards in British history. It was the moment we finally stepped out of the shadow of the Victorian era and into the warmth of the modern world. We would never want to go back. No one yearns for the return of the chamber pot or the smell of Jice fluid on a frosty morning. But we should respect the memory. That humble, freezing shed at the bottom of the garden was the crucible that forged the stoic character of the British working class. It reminds us to be grateful every time we turn a tap and hot water flows or walk barefoot across a warm floor. We have traded the character-building cold for comfort, and while that is undoubtedly a victory, we must never forget the sheer, shivering toughness it took to survive the days when the toilet was outside and the winter was waiting.